The desert sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating Base Viper, casting long shadows across the dusty compound where soldiers moved with the practiced efficiency of those who had learned to survive in hostile territory. The Afghan heat was nothing new to Captain Sarah Chen, but today it felt different. Today, everything was about to change. She stood in the supply tent, her black hair falling to her shoulders in regulation style, checking inventory reports that seemed increasingly meaningless with each passing hour. The radio chatter in the background spoke of incoming personnel transfers, routine resupply missions, and the endless bureaucracy of war. What it didn't mention was the storm brewing just outside the tent flaps. "Hey, look what we got here," came a voice from behind her, dripping with the kind of arrogance that Sarah had encountered too many times before. She turned to see Sergeant First Class Mike Rodriguez, flanked by 3 other soldiers she didn't recognize. Their uniforms were clean, their boots polished, and their attitudes suggested they were fresh from stateside assignments rather than the grizzled veterans this forward base typically housed. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice level and professional despite the immediate tension she sensed in the group. Rodriguez looked her up and down with unconcealed disdain. "Just wondering what a little girl like you is doing in a place like this. Shouldn't you be back home making sandwiches or something?" The other soldiers snickered, their laughter echoing off the tent walls like the sound of hyenas circling wounded prey. Sarah had heard variations of the same commentary countless times throughout her military career, but something about this group felt different. More dangerous. "I'm Captain Chen," she said simply, letting her rank speak for itself. "Captain?" Rodriguez laughed outright. "Lady, I've been in this army for 15 years. I know what a captain looks like, and you ain't it." One of the other soldiers, a stocky man with sergeant stripes, stepped forward. "We heard there was some kind of disciplinary issue with one of the female personnel. Someone who's been impersonating an officer." Sarah felt her blood run cold. She reached for her identification, but Rodriguez was faster, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist with unnecessary force. "I don't think so, sweetheart. We're here on official business. Seems like someone's been playing dress-up with ranks they didn't earn." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a roadside bomb. Sarah knew exactly what was happening. She had seen this kind of systematic harassment before, though never directed at her with such organized precision. Someone had fed these soldiers false information, and they were acting on it with the kind of zealous authority that came from believing they were in the right. "There's been a mistake," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the rage building in her chest. "If you'll just let me show you my identification." "The only mistake," interrupted the third soldier, a tall man with corporal stripes, "is thinking you could fool anyone with that act. Real officers don't hide in supply tents checking inventory." The fourth member of their group, who had remained silent until now, spoke up with a voice that carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Command wants to see you immediately. And they want to see what's under all that hair while we're at it." Sarah's hand instinctively went to her hair. In the military, a woman's hair was often one of the last vestiges of femininity allowed in an otherwise sterile, masculine environment. The threat wasn't subtle. "My hair is within regulation," she said. "Not for someone impersonating an officer," Rodriguez replied. "See, real soldiers follow orders without question. And our orders are very specific about how to handle this situation." The group began to close in around her, their movements coordinated like a pack of predators. Sarah realized with growing alarm that this wasn't a random act of harassment. This was planned, organized, and sanctioned by someone higher up the chain of command. Someone who wanted to humiliate her in the most public and degrading way possible. "You can come with us quietly," the tall corporal said, "or we can make this difficult. Either way, you're coming." Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could fight, but 4 against 1 in close quarters meant she would lose, and resisting would only give them more justification for whatever they planned to do. She could try to reach someone in command, but clearly someone in command had already given these men their orders. Her only option was to endure whatever was coming and trust that the truth would eventually surface. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "But this is a mistake that someone is going to pay for." Rodriguez laughed. The only person paying for anything is you, princess. They marched her out of the supply tent and, across the compound, drawing curious stares from other personnel. Sarah kept her head high and her shoulders back, maintaining military bearing even as whispers followed in their wake. Word traveled fast on a forward operating base, and she could see soldiers emerging from their quarters and duty stations to witness whatever spectacle was about to unfold. The destination was the central courtyard, a large open area typically used for formations and briefings. Someone had set up a metal chair in the center, surrounded by what looked like half the base personnel. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the scope of what was planned. This wasn't just harassment, it was a public humiliation designed to destroy not just her dignity but her credibility as an officer. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez called out to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the theatrical quality of someone enjoying his moment in the spotlight. "We have here someone who has been impersonating a commissioned officer of the United States Army." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah saw faces she recognized, soldiers she had served with, worked alongside, and, in some cases, commanded. The confusion and uncertainty in their expressions told her that many of them were as bewildered by this turn of events as she was. Now, according to military regulation, Rodriguez continued, producing an electric razor from seemingly nowhere, unauthorized personnel found impersonating officers are subject to immediate disciplinary action. Starting with removal of non-regulation appearance modifications. The razor hummed to life, its electric buzz cutting through the desert air like an angry insect. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized what was about to happen. They were going to shave her head in front of the entire base, stripping away her dignity one strand at a time while everyone watched. "Sit down," the stocky sergeant commanded, gesturing toward the chair. Sarah remained standing. "I demand to speak to my commanding officer." "Your commanding officer," Rodriguez said with mock sympathy, "is the one who authorized this little demonstration. Now sit down, or we'll make you sit down." The crowd had grown larger, soldiers pressing forward to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Sarah could see some faces filled with curiosity, others with discomfort, and still others with the kind of cruel anticipation that came from watching someone else's downfall. "This is illegal," Sarah said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I am a commissioned officer in the United States Army, and what you're doing constitutes assault under the Uniform Code of Military Justice." "Big words for a little girl playing soldier," Rodriguez sneered. "But here's the thing about the Army, rank has its privileges, and fake rank gets you nothing but trouble." Two of the soldiers moved to flank her, their hands moving to her shoulders with clear intent. Sarah realized she was out of options. Whatever was happening here had been orchestrated from above, and resistance would only make things worse. She sat down in the chair. The crowd pressed closer, forming a tight circle around the makeshift barbershop. Sarah could feel hundreds of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others hostile, all curious about what would happen next. The desert wind picked up, swirling dust around their feet and adding an almost cinematic quality to the surreal scene. Rodriguez stepped behind her, the razor still buzzing ominously. "Any last words before we fix this little misunderstanding?" Sarah looked out at the crowd, her eyes moving from face to face, committing each one to memory. These were soldiers she had trained with, fought alongside, and bled with. Some of them knew exactly who she was, but their silence in this moment spoke volumes about the power dynamics at play. "The truth has a way of surfacing," she said simply. Rodriguez laughed. "Truth? Honey, the truth is that real soldiers earn their rank through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. They don't just show up and pretend to be something they're not." The first pass of the razor cut through her hair like a scythe through wheat, black strands falling to the dusty ground around the chair. The crowd was completely silent now, watching with the morbid fascination of spectators at a public execution. "Look at that," Rodriguez commented as he continued his work. "Underneath all that feminine nonsense, she looks just like any other raw recruit. Funny how rank disappears when you strip away the pretense." More hair fell, each pass of the razor taking away not just strands but pieces of identity that Sarah had carried for years. She kept her eyes fixed on a point in the distance, refusing to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her break. The stocky sergeant leaned in close enough for her to smell the coffee on his breath. You know what your problem is? You think being a woman gives you some kind of special treatment. Well, this is the army, not some corporate diversity program. Here, you earn what you get. And, what you've earned, added the tall corporal, is a lesson in humility. The razor continued its methodical work, reducing Sarah's regulation hairstyle to stubble and, then, to skin. With each pass, the crowd seemed to lean in closer, as if drawn by some primitive instinct to witness the complete destruction of another human being's dignity. You know what the funny thing is? Rodriguez said conversationally as he worked. We actually had a real captain show up here yesterday. West Point graduate, combat veteran, the whole package. Makes it pretty obvious when someone's trying to fake their way through. Sarah's eyes sharpened. A real captain? Yesterday? The pieces of a larger puzzle began to fall into place in her mind, but she kept her thoughts to herself. That's the difference between real officers and pretenders, the stocky sergeant chimed in. Real officers command respect without having to demand it. They've got that presence, you know? That authority that comes from actually earning their position. Instead of whatever this is, Rodriguez gestured at Sarah with the razor. Some kind of affirmative action experiment gone wrong. The crowd stirred uneasily at that comment. Even in an environment where casual sexism was often overlooked, the racial undertones struck many of the assembled soldiers as crossing a line. Sarah caught several uncomfortable glances and shifting feet among the spectators. Almost done here, Rodriguez announced as he made the final passes with the razor. There we go. Now you look like what you actually are, a recruit who got too big for her britches. He stepped back to admire his handiwork, the razor finally falling silent. Sarah sat in the chair, her head completely shaved, stubble catching the harsh desert sunlight. The transformation was stark and deliberate. Where minutes before had sat a woman with the bearing and appearance of a commissioned officer, now sat someone who looked like she belonged at the very bottom of the military hierarchy. Stand up, Rodriguez commanded. Let everyone get a good look at what happens when you try to fool the United States Army. Sarah stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. She turned to face the crowd, her chin raised and her back straight despite everything that had just happened. The silence that greeted her was profound, hundreds of soldiers staring at a woman who had just been systematically humiliated but somehow still managed to project an aura of dignity. There you have it, folks, Rodriguez announced to the crowd. Problem solved. Sometimes the best way to deal with troublemakers is to remind them exactly where they stand in the order of things. The crowd began to murmur and shift, many clearly uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed but uncertain about how to respond. Sarah could see questions in their faces, doubts about what they had been told and what they had just seen. Rodriguez was gathering up the scattered hair from around the chair when a commotion at the edge of the crowd caught his attention. Soldiers were stepping aside, creating a pathway through the assembled personnel. The murmur of conversation died away as someone important approached. What's going on here? Came a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of high command. Sarah turned toward the voice and felt her heart skip a beat. Walking through the crowd was Brigadier General Patricia Morrison, her silver star gleaming in the desert sun. General Morrison was a legend in military circles, a combat veteran who had risen through the ranks to become one of the highest-ranking female officers in the Army. Her presence at a forward operating base like Viper was unprecedented. Rodriguez snapped to attention, his previous swagger evaporating instantly. General Morrison, ma'am. We were just handling a disciplinary matter involving someone impersonating an officer. General Morrison's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the chair, the scattered hair, and, most importantly, the woman standing in the center of it all with her head freshly shaved. Her expression was unreadable, but Sarah could see the muscles in her jaw tightening. And, who authorized this disciplinary action, Sergeant? Ma'am, we received orders from command that there was an impersonator on base. Someone claiming to be a captain without proper authority. General Morrison stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. I see. And, did you verify these orders through proper channels? Rodriguez's confidence began to waver. Ma'am, the orders came through the chain of command. We were told to handle the situation immediately. Show me these orders. Rodriguez fumbled in his pocket, producing a folded piece of paper. General Morrison examined it carefully, her expression growing darker with each line she read. Sergeant Rodriguez, she said finally, her voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that experienced soldiers recognized as a warning. Do you know who I am? Yes, ma'am. You're General Morrison. That's correct. And, do you know why I'm here at Forward Operating Base Viper? Rodriguez swallowed hard. No, ma'am. General Morrison turned to address the entire crowd, her voice carrying across the silent courtyard. I'm here because 3 days ago, one of our most decorated officers went missing during a classified operation behind enemy lines. An officer who had been operating under deep cover for the past 6 months, gathering intelligence that has saved countless American lives. The crowd stirred uneasily, sensing that the narrative they had been fed was about to be turned on its head. This officer, General Morrison continued, managed to escape enemy capture and make her way back to friendly territory after being presumed dead for 72 hours. She arrived at this base yesterday morning, exhausted, dehydrated, and still carrying intelligence that could change the course of this war. Rodriguez was beginning to look pale. Sarah remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the general. The orders you claim to have received, Sergeant Rodriguez, were fabricated by enemy agents who had intercepted our communications and were attempting to discredit and neutralize our operative before she could deliver her intelligence. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could see the color draining from Rodriguez's face as the implications of what had just been revealed sank in. General Morrison stepped directly in front of Sarah, coming to attention and rendering a perfect military salute. Major Sarah Chen, it is my honor to inform you that you have been promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, effective immediately, in recognition of your extraordinary service behind enemy lines. The crowd exploded into shocked murmurs as the truth hit them like a physical blow. The woman they had just watched being humiliated wasn't an impersonator at all, she was one of their own heroes, a decorated officer who had just survived a mission that most soldiers could only imagine in their worst nightmares. Rodriguez dropped the electric razor, the device clattering on the ground as he stared in horror at what he had just done. The other 3 soldiers who had participated in the humiliation looked like they were about to be sick. Lieutenant Colonel Chen, General Morrison continued, I apologize on behalf of the United States Army for the treatment you have received. A full investigation will be conducted, and those responsible will face appropriate consequences. Sarah returned the general's salute with crisp precision, her voice steady despite everything she had endured. Thank you, General Morrison. I understand that mistakes happen in the fog of war. But General Morrison wasn't finished. She turned back to face Rodriguez and his companions, her expression shifting from respectful to thunderous. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, you and your team are under arrest for assault on a superior officer, dereliction of duty, and acting on falsified orders without verification. You will be remanded to military police custody immediately pending court-martial proceedings. Military police who had been waiting at the edge of the crowd moved forward with zip-tie restraints. Rodriguez looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. General, we didn't know, he began. You didn't know because you didn't follow proper procedures, General Morrison cut him off. You acted on emotions and prejudice rather than military protocol. In doing so, you compromised operational security and assaulted a fellow soldier. Your ignorance is not an excuse, it's an indictment. As the MPs began restraining Rodriguez and his team, General Morrison addressed the crowd one final time. Let this be a lesson to everyone present. The strength of our military lies not in our willingness to tear each other down, but in our commitment to lift each other up. Every soldier in this army has earned their place through sacrifice and dedication, regardless of their gender, race, or background. When we forget that principle, we become our own worst enemy. The crowd began to disperse, soldiers walking away with their heads down and their assumptions shattered. Sarah remained standing in the center of the courtyard, her newly shaved head gleaming in the desert sun, but her dignity somehow intact and even enhanced by everything that had transpired. General Morrison approached her again, this time speaking in a voice low enough that only Sarah could hear.
The intelligence you gathered behind enemy lines has already been acted upon.
Because of your sacrifice, we were able to prevent an attack on 3 different coalition bases.
You saved hundreds of lives, Colonel.
Sarah nodded once, accepting the praise with the same stoic grace she had accepted the humiliation. There's something else, General Morrison continued.
Your promotion comes with a new assignment.
I want you to head up a new training program designed to combat exactly the kind of prejudice and procedural breakdown we witnessed here today.
I'd be honored, General.
The program will be called Operation Dignity, focused on ensuring that every soldier understands not just the letter of military law, but the spirit of military brotherhood and sisterhood that makes us strong. As General Morrison walked away, Sarah was left alone in the courtyard with her thoughts. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, the words echoed in her mind as she reflected on what had just transpired. The weak self was the part that sought acceptance and approval from others. The weak self was the part that internalized the doubts and prejudices of those who couldn't see past surface appearances. The weak self was the part that would have broken under the humiliation and surrendered to the narrative that others tried to impose. But Sarah had destroyed that weak self long ago, forged in the crucible of military training, combat experience, and the countless small battles that every female soldier fought just to be seen as an equal. The woman who sat in that chair and endured public humiliation was not weak, she was a warrior who understood that true strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from enduring it with dignity intact. The scattered hair around the chair would blow away with the next desert wind, but the lesson learned here today would resonate through the ranks for years to come. Sarah Chen, now Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, had become something more than just a soldier. She had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that appearances could deceive, and that true leadership was measured not by how you treated those above you in rank, but by how you treated those who appeared to be beneath you. As the sun began to set over forward operating Base Viper, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Sarah finally allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight, both literal and figurative. But tonight, she could rest knowing that she had faced the worst that prejudice and ignorance could throw at her, and emerged stronger than before. The morning after the courtyard incident dawned gray and cool, unusual weather for the Afghan desert that seemed to match the subdued mood permeating forward operating Base Viper.
Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen stood before the mirror in her temporary quarters, running her hand over her shaved scalp. The reflection looking back at her was stark but somehow more honest than the carefully maintained appearance she had worn for years. There was a knock at her door, sharp and military in its precision. Sarah straightened her uniform and opened it to find General Morrison standing outside, flanked by a small entourage of officers Sarah didn't recognize. Colonel Chen, I hope you slept well. We have work to do.
Sarah stepped aside to allow the group entry. General Morrison moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to transforming chaos into order, immediately setting up a portable briefing station on the small table that served as Sarah's desk. These are Colonels Martinez and Thompson from Army Personnel Command, and Major Williams from the Inspector General's office, General Morrison said by way of introduction. They're here to help us understand exactly how yesterday's incident was orchestrated and ensure it never happens again. Colonel Martinez, a stern-faced man in his 50s, opened a thick folder and began laying out documents.
Colonel Chen, we've been conducting interviews since last night.
What we've discovered is troubling. Sarah took a seat across from the assembled officers, her posture erect and attentive despite the exhaustion that still weighed on her shoulders. The falsified orders that Sergeant Rodriguez and his team acted upon were sophisticated, Colonel Thompson continued. Someone with access to official communications channels and knowledge of military protocol created them.
This wasn't the work of foreign agents, as we initially suspected.
General Morrison's expression darkened.
Tell her about Captain Brennan.
Major Williams consulted his notes before speaking. Captain David Brennan arrived at this base 4 days ago with orders transferring him from Fort Campbell. He's been spreading rumors about a female imposter among the officer corps, claiming he had inside information about disciplinary issues.
Where is Captain Brennan now? Sarah asked. That's the problem, Colonel Martinez replied. He disappeared sometime during the night.
His quarters were cleared out, and there's no record of him signing out through any official channels. Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place in her mind.
What do we know about his background?
That's where things get interesting, General Morrison said grimly. Captain Brennan's service record shows a pattern of complaints filed against female officers under his command. 3 separate incidents of harassment, 2 formal reprimands, and a pending investigation for misconduct that was mysteriously dropped when his transfer orders came through. Someone wanted him here specifically, Sarah concluded.
It appears so. The question is who, and why?
Colonel Thompson spread out a map of the base, marking various locations with red pins.
We've traced Brennan's movements over the past 4 days.
He made contact with at least 15 different personnel, all of them enlisted men with records of disciplinary issues or complaints about military diversity policies.
He was recruiting, Sarah said.
Building a network of soldiers who would be willing to act on his information without questioning it.
Exactly.
And he was smart about it. He targeted men who had grievances against the system and gave them an outlet for their frustration. Major Williams leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering particularly bad news.
Colonel, there's something else. We've found evidence that this wasn't Brennan's first attempt.
He's been systematically targeting female officers across multiple bases, using similar tactics.
The room fell silent as the implications sank in.
This wasn't just harassment, it was a coordinated campaign designed to undermine women in the military through humiliation and character assassination.
How many others? Sarah asked quietly.
At least 6 that we've identified so far. All of them experienced incidents that forced them to request transfers or, in 2 cases, resign their commissions entirely. General Morrison stood and began pacing, her jaw set in the kind of rigid line that suggested barely controlled anger.
This man has been allowed to operate with impunity across our entire command structure.
The question now is how we stop him and hold accountable everyone who enabled this behavior. General, Sarah said, I'd like to volunteer to help track him down.
Absolutely not.
You've been through enough, and, frankly, you're too close to this situation to maintain objectivity. Sarah stood as well, matching the general's intensity with her own.
With respect, ma'am, that's exactly why I need to be involved.
I understand his methods now, his psychology.
I can anticipate his next move. Colonel Martinez looked between the 2 women, sensing the tension. What did you have in mind, Colonel Chen? Sarah moved to the map, studying the patterns marked by the red pins.
Brennan is a predator, but he's also a coward. He operates by manipulating others to do his dirty work while keeping his own hands clean.
That means he needs to maintain his cover identity as a legitimate officer. Go on, General Morrison said. He can't stay hidden forever.
He'll need to resurface at another base, probably under a different identity but using the same methods. And, when he does, I want to be there waiting for him. That would require going undercover ourselves, Colonel Thompson pointed out.
Setting up a false identity, infiltrating whatever base he targets next. I'm willing to do that.
General Morrison stopped pacing and fixed Sarah with a hard stare. Colonel, you just spent 6 months behind enemy lines on a classified mission. You deserve rest and recovery, not another assignment that could put you in danger. General, with respect, every day this man operates freely, more women in uniform are at risk.
How many careers is he going to destroy before we stop him? How many talented officers are we going to lose because someone decided they don't belong in our army? The room fell silent as Sarah's words hung in the air. Finally, General Morrison spoke. What would you need?
Sarah turned back to the map, her mind already working through the logistics. A small team of volunteers, preferably people who understand the psychology of harassment and have experience with undercover operations.
False documentation that will hold up under scrutiny. And intelligence on where Brennan is likely to strike next. Major Williams consulted another file.
Based on his patterns, he tends to target smaller forward operating bases and training facilities, places where communication with higher command is limited and local commanders have more autonomy. There are 3 bases that fit that profile in his likely operational area, Colonel Martinez added, pointing to locations on a larger regional map. Fort Sandberg in Nevada, Camp Morrison in Arizona, and Forward Operating Base Thunder in California. Sarah studied the locations carefully. Fort Sandberg is the most likely target. It's remote enough to limit outside oversight, and it has a high percentage of female personnel due to its role as a logistics training center. That's what I was thinking too, General Morrison said. But, Colonel, if we do this, you won't be going in alone. I'm assigning you a full team of investigators. I appreciate that, General, but a large team would draw attention. Brennan is smart, he'll spot an investigation coming from a mile away. Then, what do you suggest? Sarah was quiet for a moment, formulating her approach. I go in as a newly transferred officer with a record of minor disciplinary issues. Someone who looks vulnerable to recruitment by his network. Meanwhile, my team operates separately, posing as enlisted personnel with their own grievances against the system. Colonel Thompson nodded approvingly. A honey trap operation. Make yourself an attractive target and see if he takes the bait. Exactly. But, this time, when he tries to orchestrate another humiliation campaign, we'll be ready for him. General Morrison considered the proposal carefully. It's risky. If something goes wrong, you could end up in the same situation as yesterday, but without backup close enough to help. General, yesterday proved something important. When you know who you are and what you stand for, no amount of humiliation can truly touch you. They can shave your head, strip away your dignity, and try to make you feel worthless, but they can't change the truth of your service or the strength of your character. Major Williams looked up from his notes. There's another consideration. If we expose Brennan's operation publicly, it could serve as a deterrent to others who might be tempted to follow similar tactics. Agreed, Sarah said. But we need to be smart about how we do it. A public court-martial would send the right message, but only if we can prove a pattern of behavior across multiple incidents. We'll need testimony from his other victims, Colonel Martinez observed. Some of them might be reluctant to come forward. Leave that to me, General Morrison said. I'll personally reach out to each of them. They need to know that the Army is finally taking this seriously. Sarah spent the next hour reviewing files on Brennan's previous victims, each case a variation on the same theme of systematic harassment disguised as military discipline. The stories were heartbreakingly similar: talented officers targeted for humiliation, their careers derailed by coordinated campaigns of intimidation. Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez had been forced to endure a public inspection of her living quarters that turned into a degrading search for contraband that was never found. Captain Jennifer Walsh had been subjected to repeated fitness evaluations that were clearly designed to question her physical capabilities. Major Angela Foster had been falsely accused of fraternization and forced to defend herself against charges that were ultimately dropped, but not before damaging her reputation permanently. This man is a cancer, Sarah said after reviewing the files. He's not just targeting individual women, he's trying to poison the entire culture of military service for female personnel. Which is why we need to cut him out completely, General Morrison replied. No plea deals, no quiet resignations. Full prosecution and public accountability. Colonel Thompson gathered up the scattered documents. I'll coordinate with Fort Sandberg's command structure to set up your cover identity. What rank do you want to assume for the operation? Sarah considered the question carefully. Captain. Senior enough to be worth targeting, but junior enough to seem vulnerable to someone like Brennan. And your backstory? Recent transfer due to personality conflicts with previous command staff. Maybe some minor infractions that suggest I don't fit the military mold perfectly. The kind of record that would appeal to someone looking for a target. Major Williams made notes as she spoke. I'll work with personnel to create a believable service history. What about your cover identity? Keep it as close to truth as possible. Military intelligence background, but with some disciplinary issues that prevented advancement. Someone with skills but attitude problems. General Morrison stood and extended her hand. Colonel Chen, you're taking on a difficult and dangerous assignment.
Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do?
Sarah stood and shook the general's hand firmly. General, yesterday I learned something important about myself. I learned that my strength doesn't come from other people's approval or respect. It comes from knowing that I'm fighting for something bigger than myself.
And what's that?
The right of every person who serves this country to be judged on their merit rather than their appearance. The right of every soldier to be evaluated on their performance rather than their gender or race or background. The right of every American in uniform to serve with dignity. General Morrison smiled for the first time since arriving at the base. That's exactly the kind of motivation that makes me confident this operation will succeed. As the meeting broke up and the officers filed out of Sarah's quarters, she remained standing by the window, looking out at the base where her humiliation had become her transformation. The weak self that had worried about appearances and approval was gone, burned away in the crucible of public shame. What remained was something harder and more focused, a warrior with a mission that transcended personal advancement. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Sarah understood now that yesterday's ordeal hadn't been a defeat at all, it had been a liberation. Free from the need to maintain a carefully crafted image, she could focus entirely on the work that truly mattered. Her reflection in the window showed a woman with a shaved head and scars that would never fully heal, but also eyes that burned with purpose. Tomorrow she would begin preparing for an undercover operation that would test every skill she had developed over years of military service. But tonight, she could rest in the knowledge that she had found her true calling. The hunt for Captain David Brennan was about to begin, and Sarah Chin intended to be the one who brought him down. 3 weeks later, Captain Sarah Lewis, her cover identity for Operation Dignity, drove through the gates of Fort Sandburg with a manufactured service record that painted her as exactly the kind of officer that Captain David Brennan would find irresistible to target. Her hair had grown back just enough to be regulation length, but the psychological transformation from her experience at Forward Operating Base Viper remained complete. Fort Sandburg sprawled across the Nevada desert like a small city, its beige buildings and training facilities shimmering in the heat. As a logistics training center, it housed over 3,000 personnel, including a higher-than-average percentage of female officers and enlisted soldiers. It was perfect hunting ground for someone like Brennan. Sarah's cover story was carefully crafted to appeal to a predator's instincts. Captain Lewis was a military intelligence officer with a promising early career derailed by attitude problems and conflicts with male superiors. Her file contained just enough disciplinary notes to suggest someone who challenged authority inappropriately while maintaining enough competence to be worth breaking down. She reported to the base commander, Colonel Richard Hayes, a career logistics officer who had been briefed on the operation at the highest levels of classification. His performance as her receiving officer was Oscar-worthy, polite but clearly skeptical, welcoming but with obvious reservations about her reputation. Captain Lewis, Colonel Hayes said as she stood at attention in his office. I've reviewed your file, and I'll be frank, you're here because someone downtown thinks you deserve another chance. I'm willing to provide that chance, but I won't tolerate the kind of problems that plagued your previous assignments. Understood, sir. I'm committed to proving that my past issues were situational rather than character-based. See that you do. You'll be assigned to the Intelligence Analysis Division under Major Patterson. He's been briefed on your background and will be monitoring your performance closely. Major Patterson, Sarah knew from her briefings, was actually part of her investigative team. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, no relation to the Sergeant Rodriguez from FOB Viper, would be serving as her enlisted team leader, also part of the operation. As Sarah left the commander's office, she was already scanning for signs of Brennan's presence. He would be operating under a different identity, but certain patterns would remain constant. He would be charismatic, confident, and positioned to have access to personnel files and base communications. Her first opportunity came during in-processing at the personnel office. While waiting in line with other newly arrived officers, she struck up a conversation with Captain Monica Torres, a supply officer who had arrived the previous week. How are you finding Fort Sandburg? Sarah asked with the kind of casual friendliness that encouraged confidences. It's been interesting, Captain Torres replied, her tone suggesting layers of meaning.
There are some strong personalities here, if you know what I mean.
Such as? Well, there's this major in operations who seems to have very definite ideas about how things should be run.
Major Davidson.
He's been asking a lot of questions about the female officers on base, our backgrounds, our performance records, that kind of thing.
Sarah's pulse quickened. Major Davidson, that would be Brennan's cover identity. What kind of questions?
Oh, whether we're meeting military standards, if we're receiving any special treatment, whether our male colleagues have confidence in our abilities. He says he's working on some kind of readiness assessment for the base commander. That sounds legitimate, Sarah said carefully, playing her role as someone who wouldn't immediately recognize the warning signs.
Maybe. But some of the questions felt more personal than professional.
And he seemed particularly interested in anyone who might have had disciplinary issues in previous assignments. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Brennan was already working, already identifying potential targets.
Have you talked to him yourself? Not directly. But I heard he's been asking about you specifically. About me?
But I just arrived. Word travels fast on a base this size.
Your file was flagged for review by the operations department as soon as you checked in.
Sarah thanked Captain Torres for the information and made her way to her assigned quarters, mind racing with the implications of what she had learned. Brennan was already aware of her arrival and had identified her as a potential target. The trap was working, but it also meant she was walking into immediate danger. Her quarters were Spartan but functional, typical military housing for mid-level officers. As she unpacked her carefully selected personal items, chosen to reinforce her cover identity as someone with authority issues, she reviewed what she knew about Brennan's methods. He operated by building networks of like-minded soldiers who shared his prejudices, then feeding them information designed to trigger their worst impulses. The humiliation was always carried out by others while he remained at a distance, plausibly deniable but clearly orchestrating events behind the scenes. That evening, Sarah made her way to the officers' club for dinner, knowing that Brennan would likely make contact within the first few days of her arrival. She chose a table with good sight lines to the entrance and ordered a meal while appearing to read personnel manuals, the picture of a dedicated but unpopular officer trying to rehabilitate her career.
Captain Lewis? Sarah looked up to see a tall, handsome man in his early 40s wearing major's insignia.
His smile was warm and professional, exactly the kind of charismatic presence that would put people at ease while hiding darker motivations. Major Davidson, he continued, extending his hand.
I understand you'll be working in intelligence analysis. Mind if I join you?
Of course, sir.
Please.
Major Davidson, Captain David Brennan, settled into the chair across from her with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention.
Sarah studied his face carefully, memorizing details that would be crucial for future identification. I always like to welcome new officers personally, he said. It's important that everyone feels integrated into the team from day one.
I appreciate that, sir. I know my record hasn't been perfect, but I'm committed to doing better here.
Your record? Davidson laughed dismissively.
Captain, everyone has rough patches in their career.
The question is whether you learn from them.
Sarah noted how quickly he had steered the conversation toward her supposed disciplinary problems.
I think I have, sir. My issues were mainly with commanders who didn't appreciate different perspectives.
Ah, Davidson said, leaning forward with apparent interest.
Different perspectives. Tell me more about that.
Well, sir, I've always believed that military effectiveness should be measured by results rather than adherence to traditional hierarchies. Some of my previous commanders interpreted that as insubordination. It was a careful statement designed to sound like someone with legitimate grievances against an unfair system, exactly the kind of attitude that Brennan would want to exploit and ultimately punish.
I see. And what kind of results were you achieving that your commanders didn't appreciate?
Sarah launched into a carefully rehearsed story about intelligence analyses that had been initially rejected by male superiors but later proven correct, painting herself as someone whose competence was undermined by gender bias. It was exactly the kind of narrative that would appeal to Brennan's sense of justice while also marking her as someone who needed to be taken down.
That must have been very frustrating, Davidson said sympathetically.
There are still some elements in the military that haven't adapted to the reality of modern warfare.
Yes, sir. I've found that some male officers feel threatened by competent women.
Davidson's eyes flickered with something that might have been satisfaction.
Have you found that to be widespread? More than I'd like, sir. It's subtle most of the time, but it's definitely there.
They talked for another 30 minutes, with Davidson skillfully drawing out more details about Sarah's fictitious conflicts with male authority figures. She gave him exactly what he wanted, a portrait of a talented but troubled female officer who blamed her problems on gender discrimination rather than personal failings. As the conversation wound down, Davidson stood and shook her hand again.
Captain Lewis, I think you're going to find Fort Sandburg much more welcoming than your previous assignments. We believe in judging people on their merit here.
Thank you, sir. I look forward to proving myself. After Davidson left, Sarah remained at her table for another few minutes, processing what had just happened. The man was smooth, professional, and completely convincing in his role as a sympathetic superior officer. If she hadn't known what to look for, she might have been genuinely grateful for his apparent understanding and support. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah settled into her routine at Fort Sandburg while carefully monitoring Davidson's activities. He was building his network exactly as she had predicted, cultivating relationships with enlisted soldiers and junior officers who harbored resentments against military diversity policies. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, her undercover team member, reported that Davidson had approached him multiple times about problem officers who were receiving special treatment because of their gender or race. Rodriguez played his role perfectly, expressing frustration about political correctness in the military while carefully gathering intelligence on Davidson's recruitment methods. He's got at least a dozen guys ready to act on his word, Rodriguez reported during a carefully staged encounter in the motor pool. All of them have some kind of grievance against the system, and all of them think they're doing the army a favor by weeding out unqualified personnel.
What's his timeline? Sarah asked while pretending to inspect vehicle maintenance records.
Soon. He's been asking specific questions about your schedule, your habits, where you spend your time.
I think he's planning something for this weekend.
Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that preceded combat operations.
What about backup?
Major Patterson has teams positioned around the base. When this goes down, we'll have complete documentation and immediate response capability.
That Friday evening, Sarah received an invitation to join several other officers for drinks at the base recreation center.
The invitation came from Lieutenant Morrison, a young female officer who had been at Fort Sandburg for several months. Sarah accepted, knowing that this was likely the setup for whatever Davidson had planned. The recreation center was busy with weekend activity, soldiers unwinding after a long week of training and preparation. Sarah joined Lieutenant Morrison and 2 other female officers at a table near the bar, engaging in the kind of casual conversation that marked normal social interaction among military personnel. Captain Lewis, Lieutenant Morrison said after they had been chatting for about 30 minutes, I wanted to thank you for being so supportive of the junior officers.
It means a lot to have someone with your experience willing to mentor us. Sarah hadn't provided any mentoring, but she recognized the statement as a setup for something larger.
Of course.
We all have to look out for each other.
Absolutely. Especially since some people around here seem to think that female officers get special treatment.
What do you mean?
Oh, you know. There are always rumors about lowered standards, affirmative action promotions, that kind of thing. Sarah glanced around the room and spotted several male soldiers positioned at strategic locations. They were trying to appear casual, but their body language suggested they were waiting for some kind of signal.
Ladies, came a voice from behind them, mind if we join you? Sarah turned to see Davidson approaching with 3 other officers she didn't recognize.
But, more importantly, she spotted the same soldiers who had been positioned around the room now closing in on their table. Of course, Major, Lieutenant Morrison replied, though Sarah noticed she seemed nervous now. Davidson and his companions sat down, but the atmosphere at the table immediately became tense. Sarah realized that Lieutenant Morrison had been coerced into participating in whatever was about to happen, probably through threats or promises that she couldn't refuse. "Captain Lewis," Davidson said, his tone still friendly but with an undercurrent of something harder.
"We were just discussing the importance of maintaining standards in today's military."
"Standards are certainly important, sir," Sarah replied carefully.
"Absolutely.
And, when those standards are compromised for political reasons, it puts everyone at risk." The conversation continued in this vein for several minutes, with Davidson and his companions gradually escalating their rhetoric about military readiness and the dangers of lowering standards to accommodate diversity goals. Sarah could see the trap being set, but she also knew that her backup team was in position. "Captain Lewis," Davidson said finally, "there's something we need to discuss with you privately."
"Would you mind stepping outside?"
Sarah looked around the room and saw that the soldiers she had spotted earlier were now openly moving to block the exits.
This was it, the moment when Brennan's network would spring their trap.
"I'm comfortable discussing whatever you need to say right here, sir."
"I'm afraid that's not acceptable.
"We've received some disturbing information about your service record, and it needs to be addressed immediately." Sarah stood slowly, her hand moving instinctively toward the concealed recording device that would capture everything that was about to happen.
"What kind of information, sir?"
"The kind that suggests you've been lying about your qualifications and taking advantage of policies designed to help unqualified personnel advance beyond their capabilities." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Around the room, other soldiers began to take notice of the confrontation developing at their table. Sarah could see confusion and concern on many faces. These were decent soldiers who didn't understand what they were witnessing. "Sir, I believe there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Davidson replied, his mask finally beginning to slip, "is thinking that political correctness can replace actual competence in the United States Army." One of the soldiers who had been blocking the exit stepped forward.
"Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning."
Sarah recognized him as Sergeant Williams, one of the men Rodriguez had identified as part of Davidson's network.
"Questioning about what?"
"About falsified performance evaluations, improper relationships with superior officers, and conduct unbecoming an officer." The charges were serious and completely fabricated, designed to justify whatever humiliation they had planned.
Sarah also knew that this was the moment when her backup would move into action.
"I demand to see these allegations in writing, along with the authority under which you're acting." Davidson stood as well, his face now showing the anger that he had been carefully concealing. "You're not in a position to make demands, Captain.
You're in a position to face the consequences of your deception." "And what consequences would those be, Major?"
"Public accountability for the fraud you've committed against the United States Army." Sarah looked around the room and saw that more soldiers were gathering, drawn by the confrontation. Some looked confused, others appeared to be part of Davidson's network, and still others seemed uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. "Major Davidson," she said in a voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "I'm an officer in the United States Army with a clean service record and commendations for valor in combat. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, present it through proper channels. If not, this conversation is over."
Davidson's composure finally cracked completely. "Evidence? How about the evidence that you're exactly like every other diversity hire who thinks they can fake their way through military service? How about the evidence that real soldiers have to pick up the slack for people like you?" The room fell silent as the true nature of Davidson's motivations became clear to everyone present.
Sarah could see shock and disgust on many faces. Soldiers who had been manipulated into supporting what they thought was legitimate military discipline now realized they were witnessing something far uglier. "Major," Sarah said quietly, "I think you've made your position very clear." At that moment, Major Patterson appeared at the edge of the crowd, flanked by military police and the rest of Sarah's investigative team.
The net was closing around Davidson and his network.
"Major Davidson," Patterson called out in a voice that carried across the entire room, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, harassment of fellow officers, and conduct unbecoming an officer." Davidson turned toward Patterson with confusion and growing panic.
Who the hell are you? Major Patterson, Inspector General's office.
And, you're Captain David Brennan, currently wanted for questioning in connection with harassment incidents at 6 different military installations. The color drained from Davidson's face as he realized his carefully constructed identity had been blown. Around the room, the soldiers who had been part of his network began to understand that they had been used as pawns in a much larger scheme. Captain Sarah Lewis, Patterson continued, addressing the room, is actually Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, currently serving in an undercover capacity to investigate systematic harassment of female officers. Sarah stood and addressed the assembled soldiers directly. For the past 3 weeks, I've been working to document how good soldiers can be manipulated into participating in actions that violate everything the United States Army stands for. What you've witnessed tonight is not military discipline, it's prejudice disguised as patriotism. Sergeant Williams, who had been preparing to escort Sarah out for questioning, now stood frozen with the realization of what he had almost participated in. The men who convinced you to support this operation, Sarah continued, preyed on legitimate frustrations about military standards and readiness. But they weren't trying to make the Army stronger, they were trying to drive out qualified personnel based on nothing more than gender and race.
Major Patterson stepped forward with arrest warrants.
Captain Brennan, Sergeant Williams, Corporal Matthews, and Private First Class Johnson, you're all under arrest. The rest of you who participated in this operation will be questioned and may face charges depending on your level of involvement. As military police moved in to make arrests, Sarah felt the same mixture of satisfaction and sadness that followed any successful operation. They had stopped Brennan and exposed his network, but the damage he had done to other careers could never be fully undone. Davidson, Brennan, made one last attempt to rally his supporters.
This is exactly what I was talking about. They'll destroy anyone who questions their agenda.
But his words fell on deaf ears. The soldiers who had supported him now understood that they had been manipulated by someone who cared nothing about military effectiveness and everything about his own prejudices. As the arrests were completed and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself standing with Major Patterson in the now quiet recreation center.
"How do you feel?" he asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. Like someone who finally understands what she's fighting for. And what's that?
The right of every soldier to serve based on their merit rather than someone else's prejudices. The right of every American in uniform to be judged on their character rather than their appearance. The right of every person who takes the oath to be treated with the dignity that their service deserves.
Major Patterson nodded approvingly. That sounds like the mission statement for Operation Dignity. It is.
And this was just the beginning. 3 months later, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the Pentagon, delivering the keynote address at the launch of Operation Dignity, a military-wide program designed to combat harassment and discrimination in all its forms. Her audience included generals, junior officers, and enlisted personnel from every branch of service. "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "I learned that lesson in a courtyard in Afghanistan, where soldiers who should have been my brothers in arms chose to see an enemy instead of an ally."
The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word.
"But I also learned that strength isn't about avoiding humiliation or hardship. It's about enduring whatever comes and emerging with your principles intact. It's about knowing that your worth isn't determined by other people's approval, but by your commitment to something larger than yourself." Sarah paused, looking out at the diverse faces in the audience, men and women of every race and background, all wearing the same uniform and serving the same flag. Every person in this room has taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
That document promises equal protection under law for all Americans, regardless of their gender, race, religion, or background.
When we allow prejudice to poison our ranks, we betray that oath. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Sarah wasn't finished.
Captain David Brennan is now serving a 15-year sentence in military prison for his crimes against fellow service members.
His network of supporters faced courts-martial, and most received punishment that will follow them for the rest of their careers. But the real victory isn't in their punishment, it's in the commitment this institution is making to ensure that what they did can never happen again.
Sarah's voice grew stronger as she reached the conclusion of her address. We are the United States military.
We are the finest fighting force in the history of the world, not because of our weapons or our technology, but because of our people. When we embrace the strength that comes from our diversity, when we judge each other by our character and our commitment rather than our appearance, when we remember that our enemy is never the person standing next to us in formation, that's when we become truly unstoppable. The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at faces that reflected the best of American military service, and knew that the weak self that had once worried about acceptance and approval was gone forever. She was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, architect of Operation Dignity, and guardian of the principle that every person who serves their country deserves to do so with honor intact. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, and Sarah Chen was living proof that sometimes destruction is just another word for transformation. In the months and years that followed, Operation Dignity would become a model for military organizations around the world, a testament to the power of turning personal suffering into institutional change. But it all began with one woman sitting in a chair in the Afghan desert, having her head shaved by soldiers who thought they were humiliating her, never knowing that they were actually forging her into something stronger than they could possibly imagine. The weak self was gone. What remained was a warrior.